What is up, YouTube fam? Robbie C here, and today we're going to talk about what roadblocks you may be facing if you struggle to throw over 300 feet. But of course, before we dive in, we have to ask the most important question of the day. How you doing today, Ethan? You having a good day? So catch me if I fall. So we're gonna try to keep this, brief so that you can dive through the 5, and depending on the 5, we may end up making a video truly about sort of every single one of these as we get on the road. This was a YouTube advice that I got a long time ago. Instead of making a video about the top 10 Thanksgiving dishes that you should have, make 10 videos and really go in depth on each of them. So this is the primer for the 5, and you guys are gonna let me know in the comments below whether you think you're struggling with this or what order we should do them in, because spoiler alert, I've already done a video on one of them. But I believe there are 5 things that if you struggle to throw 300 feet or you find yourself sort of stuck at 300 feet, these could be things holding you back. Obviously, physical limitations, whether it comes from natural disabilities, age, whatever it may be, those can factor in as well. But I think that these 5 things really are pretty universal. And as someone who's doing lessons quite often, if I find a student doesn't throw 300 feet, it's probably one of these things that's holding them back to begin with. The first is power leaking from the legs. When we think about how we're supposed to use our feet on the tee box, there are 2 common things that people are doing that are diverting or drawing away from their power. Now, lots of folks who can't throw 300 feet are going to default into standstills. I have no problem with standstills. Obviously, Blitz, who I've been working with, he throws super far with standstills, but others, I understand, like myself, are going to want to naturally move into an X-step and have those patterns to them. Now, what do we mean by power leaking from the X-step? The power leaking from sort of the lower body is coming from either closing your hips off too much to where you're too far turned backwards and they just can't actually fire. This is an extreme that I found myself in for a little while. Or you go to the opposite end of the spectrum and your hips are actually super open, especially if you have a tennis background. I believe tennis tries to have some more open hips to them, and you're going to have it so open that there's just no engagement happening from here, so my arm is everything for the throw. When we're trying to line the feet up, we want to make sure that our feet are staggered, and what we mean by staggered is traditionally we're going to be drawing a line from the toe of the back foot into the heel of the front foot. Now, I'll talk about an issue that this has later, but the main issue is that for most people, when they're lining up or they're doing their standstill, they have these feet perfectly in line like so, running straight back on the tee box. This is okay. But a lot of issues that people make is they end up going backwards into the throw, and so then when they go to plant, they're actually falling into the shot, which causes me to have sort of a pigeon-toed type feel where I'm so backwards that as I fall into the shot, my body naturally wants to catch me. So if I was throwing towards the basket or towards the camera, you'll notice that my feet are angled out like so. When my feet are angled out like this, it gets really hard to engage my hips and have them actually aid me in the process of throwing the disc. So we want to make sure that our feet are at least sort of staggered to one another. But we can take this to the extreme side of things where I think people mess up quite often. You hear stagger, and so how do I stagger? If I'm doing a standstill, obviously it's easy to set my feet accordingly and go, okay, cool. The front foot is a little offset to the back foot. Perfect. I'm ready to engage. I'm ready to fire those hips. But if you're doing a run up, this can feel a little more complicated. And people think I need to stagger that foot. So they're gonna drive all their momentum forward. And then when they get to this X step, they're then going to plant super far out here. The problem is it's like I'm driving the bus and then suddenly I just hard turn to get my momentum going this way, which means that if I suddenly want to throw towards you as the camera, I have to figure out how to get my momentum that I've just turned off to the side to then come back and through. Often it can result in some early releases because I've shifted my momentum this way, and so now I'm swinging out in that direction. The simple fix on how to get your feet right in both ways actually comes from another creator that I saw, Tai Relatos, and I love his tip. Whether you have a baseball background, basketball background, anything that involves a shuffle where you're shuffling your feet side to side. When I do this, I'm not turning my feet in and out like a crab trying to like Zoidberg this thing. I have my toes facing in the right direction, side to side. And this is what I want to end up doing, because in this side to side motion, I can push into the stride. I want the same thing to happen here, where when I go to the X step, I have my foot and the inside of my foot sort of pointed 45 degrees to the front left corner. I then, for shaping purposes, am tapping these feet together and just striding straight out. It's no different than if I was striding side to side here, but I'm gonna be striding and angling at 45 degrees, stride out, so that my toes are actually facing the same direction, but I still have my heel to toe happening on the front. This allows me to stay in an athletic position, that I'm balanced and centered between my feet, and I can actually engage the lower half of my body so that I'm not falling into trap number one, where I'm leaking power. Now, number two is disc selection. When it comes to disc selection, I think so often we're building our bags based on what we're seeing people throw. So if we're looking at pros are throwing with enough power and spin that they need the discs to have a little more stability. That doesn't mean that pros aren't throwing understable options, but it does mean that pros are throwing a more neutral option most often as their understable choice. This is where a disc like the Mako 3 shows up, because the Mako 3 is an incredibly neutral disc, but for a faster arm, it's gonna have some natural turn and drift to it. This is not gonna be the case for slower arms, but we gotta make sure that we're using discs that match our arm speed, or expecting discs to fly that actually match our arm speed, rather than watching people on Jomez throw something and hoping that it does the same thing for us. This brings us to two traps when it comes to disc selection. The first is going to be that everyone's gonna say, slow things down and only throw putters and mids. The problem with this is that putters and mids don't respond as negatively to being thrown nose up. Nose up is based on the flight path or the launch angle that I'm throwing it on. The front edge of this disc, how up or down it is, creates that nose angle. When it's nose up, more wind is gonna come back here and catch it and slow it down, and also cause things to be more overstable. So I don't think that you should just auto default to only throwing putters and mids. Once again, if you only throw putters and mids, they fly better when thrown slightly nose up, especially for putters. So it could create some really nasty habits when you find yourself moving towards fairway drivers. Now, I do think that fairway drivers are the sweet spot, and you usually, if you're not throwing above 300 feet, probably don't want to bag any fairway drivers faster than a 9 or 10 speed unless you're using them for utility. That's not saying you can't have them in your bag, but especially if you struggle with tip number 3 that we're going to talk about in terms of nose and launch angle, those bigger discs are just going to highlight things even more. But one more thing I want to talk about is, so often we're going to suggest understable discs, but based on your natural preferences of how you like to throw, an understable disc could end up being really bad for you. So I want to talk about that real fast. It's important to note that an understable disc wants to resist the flight that you put it on. So for a right-handed player throwing a backhand, we're going to be throwing it with spin that makes it want to go left. An understable disc makes it want to go right. But some people, because they put more overstable discs that want to lean into the flight path that they get, in order to get discs to fly for them, they're having to learn how to throw with a lot of anhyzer, where you pull the disc wanting it to go right, and then it fades out to the left. This creates some odd throwing tendencies, and so when you go to the beginner-friendly discs that are suggested, like a diamond or sapphire or understable side, you can end up with something like an ozone. And the problem is, this ozone is not going to be a good flyer for you if you like to throw on anhyzer. You can see that it's just not actually trying to fly. It's just burning over to the right the whole time. But if you're someone that prefers to throw a little more flat or a little more hyzer, then an understable disc could be exactly what you need for that great distance potential. Such as this also being an ozone. You can see that it stands up, it turns, and it just has so many more flight capabilities to it when I'm not throwing it on anhyzer. So if you're someone who prefers that natural angle and you've just been told over and over again, bag a diamond, bag the understable uplink, bag whatever it may be that's super understable, based on your preferred throwing angle, that could be exactly what's keeping you from that 300-foot mark. So our third tip is a combination of two things, and we actually released a video on this a couple of weeks ago talking about positive launch angle and a negative nose angle. Now, for most people, they actually have those flipped, where we're throwing with a positive nose angle and a negative launch angle. What does that look like? Essentially, your body is saying, hey, I don't want you to throw it into the ground. You don't want to throw it into the ground, so let me help you out, my guy. Launch angle refers to the path of which you are throwing the disc on. So, or essentially maybe even pulling the disc. If we think about this, if there's like, you have a skeet shooter where it's flinging the discs out and it's flinging the targets out, it's on this sort of trajectory. Lots of times it's gonna be bolted to a board or something like that so that the mechanism can send the object. This flat board is what our launch angle is going to be. So for lots of folks, they create a negative launch angle because they reach so far back and then they want to strong arm and pull in. And you can see when I do this, that if we just follow the trajectory and the path that the disc is on, when I get too aggressive in pulling the arm into a weak position for throwing, but a feeling strong position for the body, boom, I follow this path down, I've created a negative launch angle, and it's gonna throw straight into the ground. So how do we fix this? We take the nose angle of the disc is in relativity to the angle of which we launch the disc. So on that same trajectory, a negative nose angle would look like so. A positive nose angle would look like this. So if I threw it on a negative nose angle, I would throw it straight into the ground. That wouldn't go very far. My body knows that's not good. So what it's gonna do is my thumb is gonna get over involved and it's gonna push into the disc to air bounce the shot here and cause it to go nose up and skip up into infinity. Now this goes back to what we talked about, where the wind is then gonna catch this back rim of the disc, slow things down dramatically and allow discs to not fly as they're intended to. We don't get the shot shaping potential out of our disc that we want. Now, according to the internet, I spent way too much time talking about this in another video, so I'm gonna try to, if I remember, reference it here, but if not, you can go look up a video that I did recently, and the title is something along the lines of how I started throwing nose down without trying. Don't wanna harp on it too much here, because like I said, there's a lot of time invested in that video, but if you're throwing those distance drivers and you're not used to throwing distance drivers, this can become even more apparent because you want to throw faster and harder because you're throwing a faster disc, and that rim just gets so much larger, which exaggerates this nose ability even more. It's probably why, if you're struggling to throw 300 feet, that your distance drivers are going just about as far as your mid-ranges and your putters. When you're throwing out into a field, you can walk up with your entire bag and everything's kind of in the same area. That's most likely an issue of you're throwing negative launch angle and positive nose angle and everything's air bouncing. If when you're throwing the disc, you can very clearly see the stamp, most often that's gonna be for people that you're throwing super nose up. Now the fourth tip is one that I think for lots of people is something that you'll hear mentioned, but it doesn't really make sense. And if you've come from a Frisbee background at all, where you're throwing beach lids and things of that nature, it gets really, really difficult to embrace this. And I think for lots of folks, not only that swoop that's occurring, but I think that this releasing of the disc is happening. And what do we mean by this? For most people, you are trying to time a moment where you're letting go of the disc as you throw the shot. What this is doing is lowering your spin, and it's lowering the impact of your ability to input spin and power into the disc. So what do we mean by this? If I'm out here trying to throw a shot and I'm releasing the disc, that means at some point during this throw, I'm going to think about actively opening my hand in the shot to try to get the timing right. If I want to open my hand right here so that the shot goes out in a straight manner. If I'm doing this, I am saying bye-bye to a whole heap of power. So how do we fix this? The cool part is that your body with the right grip pressure actually cannot hold on to the disc properly. If I mega death grip this thing and hold on for all the power that I have and I throw my hand slow, the disc doesn't come out. You can see it's just not really ejecting. And this is why people don't believe this actually exists, because we're gripping the disc too tight and not throwing our hand fast enough. We have to find the balance in this. And one of the ways that we find this or can demonstrate this is with a towel. If I'm spinning this towel in my hand, I'm gonna hold on to this carabiner that I always keep clipped to the belt loop on the back of my pants. And I wanna spin this towel. I can hold this very loose as I spin this towel because I don't really need a lot of grip pressure. But as soon as I start spinning it fast, I'm going to increase the pressure of which I'm gripping with this hand. The same thing needs to be happening in disc golf. If we want to throw far and we want to throw in the distance and we want to throw out there, we can simply pinch onto the disc or hold onto the disc. And if we're gripping tight enough to hold onto it through the throw, when it reaches, as Dave Dunnapace would say, the tip of the whip, it's going to rip out and launch in that direction. But like I said, for some people, finding that balance can be super difficult. So this drill actually comes from overthrow, and it is the pinch drill. How do we do the pinch drill? The pinch drill is quite simple. I'm going to take two fingers and I'm going to create a pinching mechanism. I'm going to hold on to the disc. Now, if I have these two here, I'm going to simply throw the shot and throw out here like this with just these 2 fingers on the disc. And what's gonna happen? It's gonna rip out of my hand. I don't care what happens to it in that direction. Once I get used to that feeling of it ripping out, I'm gonna go from a 1 finger pinch to a 2 finger pinch. Hold on to that disc, come out. And that's how you're gonna hear people have so much snap in their shot. I'm just simply holding on with 2 fingers, and you can see right there, that was about a 200-foot shot, and I was simply holding it with 2 fingers because I'm just pinching onto these and throwing and thinking about creating and keeping this pressure the whole time and letting it rip out. Now you guessed it, once I've mastered the 2 finger, I'm gonna move on to 3 fingers. And from here, suddenly with 3 fingers, we've gone even farther. It was about 250 feet. And then finally, last but not least, I move on to a 4 finger grip or have all 4 of my fingers in the rim ready to go. This is a traditional power grip. And for lots of people, there are folks that don't even have 3 fingers in the rim. They either go front loaded with the pinky off, or they go rear loaded with the front finger sort of hooking in. Zach Nash throws really far, has high spin, and this is his grip, is much more of a 3 finger back loaded grip with the front finger kind of hanging on. The key to all of these is making sure that I don't open my hand and I let the disc rip out as it launches. Now, of course, the more power that I put into the shot, the more grip pressure I'm going to have. So if I find myself over gripping and grip locking quite often, it either means I'm not throwing fast enough to accelerate to that hit point at the very end, or I'm over gripping for the speed of which I'm throwing. This is a tool that you could literally spend an entire month on, just focusing and learning your grip pressure. And as you get better, you have to sort of relearn this as well based on what your speeds are, because your upshot speed and your distance shot speed are gonna be different grip pressures for your hand. Now, our 5th and final tip is that I believe one of the things that's holding most people back from throwing over 300 feet is that I believe you're trying to throw too hard instead of fast. This distinction is one of the biggest separators from folks who even throw, let's say, 260 to 270 to those who throw 350 to 380. Now, there was a wise sage of the internet who said, slow is smooth, smooth is far. This was Danny Lindahl with Dynamic Discs. Danny's sort of the coach that coached all of the current internet coaches. And I have to agree with Danny to most of the degrees. I think that lots of people, when they're getting into the game of disc golf, are just trying to go full power athleticism and just throw as hard as they possibly can. If I go and I watch folks who are playing in an MA3 or MA4 division, it's wild when you look at how hard folks are throwing versus the results that they're actually getting off of the tee. This is not meant to be slander or a slight to any folks in MA3 or MA4 or whatever division you're playing in. It's just something that we notice how they're throwing this hard and getting those numbers, and yet when we go watch some Pro Tour players, it doesn't look like they're throwing near as hard and they're throwing arguably twice as far. So then what's the difference maker? When we go to super tight muscles and we're trying to inject a ton of power, tight muscles are most often not fast muscles. So we have to find a balance between creating smooth and fluid muscles while also not being so loosey-goosey that we don't actually have any power behind them at all. I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't throw powerfully. I'm trying to say that you shouldn't throw hard, because there is a very important distinction between the two. We have watched so many folks who get up and, using tech disc especially, have tried to throw as hard as they possibly could. And when you look at the speed numbers that they're throwing, it's like, oh, that's not fast at all. Whereas other folks look like they're barely trying and the disc is zipping out of their hand because they're throwing super fast. This is why I had another video where I talked about people accelerating from back here and accelerating really hard and powerfully into this position, rather than thinking about being smooth to here and then sending the hand fast on the backside of the throw. If we think about doing that drill alone of slow, slow, fast, it will add so much power to the game as you're out there throwing. For instance, getting these ozones once again, if I just go slow, slow, fast, the disc comes out and it zips and it carries and it goes quite a long way with very little effort. We're in the middle of talking and I'm not out of breath, anything like that. It is repeatable, as opposed to that becomes way more aggressive and harder to do. But leaning in and embracing this smooth throw that is eventually going to lead to fast throws is going to teach your body what proper swing paths and mechanics are, so that later on you can add the speed. If you don't have speed or explosiveness to your throw, distance might avoid you for the rest of your time in this sport. The final progression of thought here is that instead of throwing hard, let's just throw that out the door, and we want to be smooth, which will then allow us to learn to be fast, which will then allow us to put in power. And it goes in that order. It's very difficult to be fast when you're just going really hard and strong. It's difficult to get the power when you're doing the other things as well. We can be smooth, into speed, into power. That's our progression. So I hope this video was helpful and that you were able to find some tips that work for you when it comes to seeing distance potential out there in your game. And if you're currently stuck at that 300-foot mark, like I said, I plan on making a full video talking about the remaining 4 of these. So you guys just let me know in the comments what order, if you were to order them up, where you'd be looking, and were any of these helpful today. Always trying to make content truly for you to help out. So thank you so much for tuning in. Hope you have an amazing rest of your day. Please make it fantastic for someone else too. But for now, we're gonna leave you with the birdie.